Welcome to the Tough Decisions Podcast, special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Each Sunday, Dennae will go through a specifically selected book to dive deep into the life decisions that we make on a regular basis as entrepreneurs and real estate investors. And now, your host, Dennae Handford.
Thank you for joining me this Sunday. We're now in part 6 of our review of the book Leaders Eat Last. Just as a brief review and summary, let's go back and talk about the leadership lessons that we learned last week. We're now into the meat part of Simon Sinek's book, Leaders Eat Last, and he gives us 5 leadership lessons. And so last week we looked at the first 2. Leadership lesson number 1, as he states it, is so goes the culture, so goes the company. Or another way of stating that is that the culture of a group determines the success or failure of a group. Leadership lesson number 2 is so goes the leader, so goes the culture. Or stated otherwise would be the leader determines the culture. So the culture determines the success or failure of the group, and the leader has the ability to determine the culture. Now, if you have not yet listened to last week's episode, that was part 5, then I would strongly urge you to go back and listen to that episode. It builds on it, and it really puts together a lot of the things that we talked about up to that point. But the first 2 leadership lessons are discussed in detail, and I think you'll find a lot of value in that. Today, we're going to look at leadership lesson 3, 4, and 5. 3 and 4 pretty briefly, and 5 will go into a little bit more detail. But let's go ahead and dive right in. Leadership lesson number 3 is simply 2 words: integrity matters. When a leader is building a culture and he or she is working to create a culture that will make the company successful, integrity is of the utmost importance. Now, Simon Sinek defines integrity as when our words and deeds are consistent with our intentions. I find that very interesting, and I had never heard integrity defined quite that way before, but he defines it as our words and deeds are consistent with our intentions. And I find this interesting because I think this actually requires a lot of honest self-examination, because we can deceive ourselves into saying, well, I intend to do this, and this is what I'm doing. But even though that may be what it looks like to us, people from the outside may look at it entirely differently. And we're talking about people who spend a great deal of time with us. I think they see us differently a lot of times than we do, because they hear a lot of things that we say and they see a lot of things that we do. And when those things are not consistent with what we also say our intentions are, then we have this disconnect created. And it becomes a problem to be able to lead those people because they don't trust what we're doing. Now, it's not just about being honest when we agree with someone, because that's easy. Let's face it. It's easy to state, yeah, you're right, I agree with you. But it's much more difficult to state when we disagree with someone, or taking it a step further, it's much more difficult to be honest when we realize, and maybe even the whole world realizes, that we made a mistake. And that is what I would call a crisis point for us and our integrity is, are we able and are we willing to stand in front of a group of people that have seen and heard everything that we've done related to a decision or related to a process? And are we willing to stand in front of them and say, I made a mistake? Or are we willing to stand up for what we believe is important and for our priorities and state when we disagree with someone? Those are those crisis moments for our integrity. If we don't do that, then the people that have seen that and the people who know us the best, that's when they lose confidence in our leadership and they lose trust in our leadership. They must see us tell the truth even when it hurts us. I think that is really the key. One quote that Simon Sinek included here in this chapter is one that really has caused me to stop and think. And the quote states this: how you do anything is how you do everything. And again, this matter of integrity is really a tricky thing, I think. It's tricky, and then it's not so tricky if we could just be objective enough about our own actions to see when we're not being consistent. It would be very simple, but the hard part is that we do have to remove ourselves from ourselves and look at what we do and what we say and realize that in probably just about everybody, there is some inconsistency, and we really have to work very hard to make sure that we are being consistent with what we say we believe and what we say we want. How you do anything is how you do everything. And this kind of brings about the point that integrity is developed over time. It is not enough to stand up and tell the truth once in your meeting or once in the life of your business. Integrity, just like relationships, as we've talked about earlier, develops over time. And we have to be able to, and we have to be willing to tell the truth all the time, even when it hurts us. And we have to do that repeatedly so that the people who following us get to the point where they trust what we say and they trust the decisions that we make, because they know that we're going to do the right thing, even if it's hurtful to us. I think about its application in our businesses, in our personal lives. I think about the application of these principles with our families and our children, and how our children and our spouse are usually the ones that see us the most. And they can spot exactly when we're not telling the truth and when we're not acting with integrity. We're not acting out of consistency. And children, I think, are especially good at this. And if we want them to trust us, and if we want them to trust the decisions that we make, then we have to be willing to speak truth to them. And we have to be willing to speak truth to them even when it makes us look bad. And part of that, at least a portion of that, is telling them, hey, you know what? I messed up. I did wrong, or I made a bad decision. Can you please forgive me? And let's correct this and let's move forward. And most people, because they are human themselves, they understand, they don't expect perfection. But what they do expect, and I think what they have a right to expect, is the truth. And so I think some of the most powerful words that we can speak as leaders is, I was wrong. I made a bad decision. Let's move forward, and let's move forward together. So integrity matters. That's leadership lesson number 3. How you do anything is how you do everything, because integrity, once it's lost, is very difficult to regain. And so it's of utmost importance that we do the very best that we can to always act consistently with what we say we intend. Now, leadership lesson number 4, friends matter. Friends matter. And Simon Sinek, he again builds off of the principles that he speaks on earlier with the oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine and endorphins. And he goes back to the principle of human beings, as we were created, are designed to be social animals or social beings, if you will. And so we work best when we work with people that we know and trust, or with friends. He gives one and develops in this chapter one really good example. And we mentioned it a little bit earlier in one of the earlier podcasts, but he talks about the effectiveness of Congress and the 2 political parties in the United States. And he gives a number of examples, but sometime around the early 1990s, Congress and its ability to work together really took a shift, a major shift. And the result was a less effective Congress, lesser ability to work together and come to a consensus, less time spent actually coming up with solutions. And Sinek points the blame for this as a shift in what the congressmen were actually doing with their time. So in the early 90s, the politicians, and forgive me for grouping everyone into that category, I know there would be a few people that would take exception to that, but for our purposes here, I'll just call them the politicians. They began spending the majority of their time in their home districts fundraising and planning for the next election, as opposed to spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And you even had a shift in the way the families operated after someone was elected to these national offices. So before that time, many, and I hesitate to say all, but many of them would, once they were elected to this national office, they would pack up, they would move their families, and they would live at least a majority of the time for those 3 or 4 years or 6 years, whatever they were elected to, they would live in the Washington, D.C. area. Their kids would go to school there. They would develop relationships and friendships there, and they would really become rooted and planted in that area. The result of that was that they had a lot of time to develop relationships with other congressmen and with other politicians with whom they were working. Well, in the early 90s, that really shifted, and a lot of times families would just stay in their home district. And there's not really anything wrong with that. I think part of that shift happened as a result of, travel becoming easier, communication becoming easier and faster, and a lot of different things at play here. But instead of moving their families and really becoming rooted in the new area, they left their families at home, and they would basically on a weekly basis fly in and out of Washington, D.C. The result being there was no spare time or extra time to develop relationships with the people they were working. It was all you'd fly in, do your work, fly home. And when you got home, you spent your time fundraising and planning so that you could get reelected the next time. And there was far less time spent developing relationships with the people whom they were supposed to be working with. And the result of that then was a less effective, less productive Congress, if you will. And from that, now we've also seen a lot of bitter struggles, I guess might be the best way of saying that, between the two parties. And it's almost gotten to the point where it's impossible to do anything because no one wants to work together. Why do they not want to work together? Because there's no time spent together. And Sinek also makes the point that, electronic meetings via, webcam or telephone, that as much as we want to substitute that for the in-person work together, it does not work. It doesn't substitute. And we can, be stubborn and say, well, I'll just have a webcam meeting, or we'll do a screen share. And, we can go against this principle if we choose to, but to our own detriment, because we as human beings were designed to be social, and we solve problems best when we're together. And together means in the same physical space together. Obviously, sometimes the electronic meetings are necessary, but it's not a substitute for being in the same physical space. Remember the experiment that was done with the teacher having to electrocute the student who was answering the question incorrectly. And the farther removed that teacher became from the student, then the less likely that teacher was to protest what was going on. And that the principle, it actually has several applications, but this is one of them, is that physical space matters. And so when you're with someone, we develop relationships with that person. Even sometimes when we don't really intend to, or we don't want to, that relationship is there. And when that relationship exists, then we are much more able to work with that person. So leadership lesson number 4, friends matter. When you want to get the most out of your employees, they have to have relationships developed. And again, that takes time. So we have to put ourselves in positions where the relationships can evolve and develop, and we have to allow time for that to happen. Leadership lesson number 5 is lead the people, not the numbers. Lead the people, not the numbers. And this is a lengthy discussion here that we could have. I'm going to try to boil it down to the most important principles and then let you check out the rest of it. But lead the people being the people in your organization, not the numbers. And around the late 1970s, 1980s, we had a shift in corporate valuation. And so CEOs and corporate leaders began to really emphasize the idea of shareholder value. And it became the CEO's focus to work solely on the profits, the bottom line, if you will, so that the shareholders' value would increase. And basically, if a CEO could increase the shareholder value, then he or she was considered a success, regardless of the changes, the tweaks, the burnt earth or scorched earth that was left in his or her wake. If they increased the shareholder value, then that person was considered a success. And we really developed a contrast between what we could call a directive type of leadership and an empowering leadership. And there were several studies actually done to find out which of these was more effective. Interestingly enough, the directive leadership, or the CEO who just gave orders and told people what to do and cut costs and created processes with the sole purpose of increasing the bottom line, that type of CEO would be considered a directive leader. That type of CEO and a company under that type of leadership would initially show higher performance. So that type of leadership would initially be more positive, or in other words, shareholder value would increase more so than the empowering leadership. But here's the catch. Over time, the empowering leadership showed bigger performance improvements. So the directive leader could come in and give orders and take control and make that bottom line increase. But under that person's leadership, the empowering leader is the one that is able to get the most improvement out of his or her people. Why? Well, we go back to the principles of the way humans were designed to work together, and an empowering leader bases his or her leadership off of the high levels of trust and safety, or the circle of safety, as we've talked about. Interestingly enough, that latter, or the empowering leadership, is also better for the long-term health of the company, because the first type of leadership bets on being able to find another just as demanding, just as ruthless directing leader when that person is gone. The second type of leadership, the empowering leadership, that person, whether he or she is realizing it or not, because they are showing improvement and because they are building their people, then he or she is actually creating an environment where a new leader can come out and take the place of that empowering leader whenever it's time for him or her to move on. So the directive leadership versus the empowering leadership, the latter produces higher rates of improvement among employees, and it's also better for the long-term health of the company. The problem is, most of the time, CEOs are in there, and if they don't show an initial jump or an initial improvement with their shareholder values or the bottom line, then that person may have a year or two and they're gone, because the environment in which we live wants immediate results. They want that dopamine hit, if you will. The unbalanced focus on achieving shareholder value and achieving a greater bottom line creates an environment where people are just tools to create wealth or balance the accounts. And that creates an unpleasant environment where there is no security. Employees are always wondering, is my job going to be the next one that's cut? Not because I did a poor job, but because somebody needs to balance the budget this month or this year. It also creates an environment where we've seen recently corporate fraud, stock manipulation, accounting fraud, all of that becomes something that is at least a possibility, because there's an over focus on creating more shareholder value. Now, shareholder value is not wrong. It's not bad. I mean, a business at least partially exists to make money, but there's a different way of looking at it. Along this same time, Professor Stout began working to figure out which type of leadership is better for the long-term health. And here we're meaning not just leadership, but long-term profit health of the company. And what he found is that the directive leadership actually doesn't even work for shareholder value long-term. And so what he looked at, among other things, was the stock market returns before this shift in thought to after. And he found that the average stock market returns after 1976, which is around the time that this mindset shift happened, was 6.5%. And if you track the average stock market returns since 2000, it's even lower than that. And this is a quote from him then, that the companies that are most successful at maximizing shareholder value over time are those that aim toward goals other than maximizing shareholder value. And so what we find is the empowering leaders, the ones that are focused on building their people and maximizing the potential and the abilities of the people in their organization, those are the ones that over time create more shareholder value anyway. But it has to be an organization-wide focus, because otherwise that individual, that leader, is not going to have the time that he or she needs to implement the strategies to do this. if everyone, or even if just a few people are uber focused on shareholder value, then that leader, if there's not immediate results, that leader's going to be gone. There's this deep desire for a dopamine hit. Give me that instant gratification. Let's meet our goals this year. If the goals are not met, then we got to do something drastic or you're gone. And as we've talked about, the development of people and the development of relationships and seeing integrity work takes time. It all takes time. And so we find ourselves in a position where we have to really overcome what, we want right now for what's good long term. And then Sinek, interestingly enough, uses an example that I think we probably will all understand. And he just briefly talks about, BP, the British Petroleum Company, and how, in the effort to preserve shareholder value, they took shortcuts. There were safety violations. There were a lack of precautions that were supposed to be required. And they took all these shortcuts in an effort to, interestingly enough, stay on schedule and on time and preserve shareholder value. But once that Gulf explosion on their oil rig took place, shareholder value, of course, just plummeted. And even 3 and 4 years later, that shareholder value was still recovering. And so the shortcuts that they took and the lack of effort that they put into the areas of safety and the proper precautions, and they were over focused on the numbers, then they obviously cost their shareholders a lot of value. And now eventually, probably, that's going to get back to where it should be and even further. But in at least the short term, they took a huge hit, and that could have been avoided. In addition to obviously avoiding the loss of life that they experienced as well, and the loss of credibility and respect that they had in the business. So the impact of leadership is best judged over time, just like with relationships and integrity and a lot of things that we've discussed up to this point take time. So does the judge of leadership. What would happen, and I leave you with this question because I think it's very thought-provoking. What happens when the leaders are gone? What if we judge a leader not on what they do when they're holding the torch, but on what happens after they pass it on? What if we judge a leader not on what they do when they're holding the torch, but on what happens after they pass it on? That's a different way of thinking. That's a different way of framing our own leadership. And I challenge you to really consider who you are leading. It's not about what happens when you're there. It's not about what happens on your watch, so to speak, although that is somewhat important. The judge of your leadership is really what happens after you've passed on that leadership, after you're off the scene as the leader. The people that you led, have you empowered them? Have you inspired them towards a direction and an intention that is good for the group? And I say group because I don't want to limit our thoughts just to a corporate organization, a family, a team, any kind of group that you are leading. What happens after you're gone as the leader? Those people, have you left them in a situation where they can pick up the torch and keep running? Because that, I think, is really the true test of whether a leader did his or her very best for the group. So we finished up our 5 leadership lessons. Today, lesson number 3, integrity matters. Lesson number 4, friends matter. And lesson number 5, lead the people, not the numbers. We will finish up with our review of the book. I actually have 2 more weeks coming up, and we'll finish up the meat of the book then. And then I have a special bonus session coming up the next week, July 22nd, where we specifically talk about some of the principles as they apply to this new group of employees that we call the millennials, because that is an interesting group with some very unique qualities. And I think as business owners and business leaders, we've probably all found ourselves facing some challenges posed by this group that we call the millennials. So I want to dive into a few principles as they particularly relate to the millennials, but we'll do that in the last week and we'll add on a bonus session, which will be part 8. So Leaders Eat Last. Join me next week for a Facebook Live. That'll be Tuesday at noon Eastern, and we'll discuss some of these principles a little bit more in depth. I'd love to hear from you. If you have comments or questions, or even have a story or two that illustrates what we've talked about, I would really love to hear about that, and that we can discuss those on our Facebook Live as well.
Make sure to subscribe to our Tough Decisions podcast channel to listen in during the week as Dan and Dennae interview successful entrepreneurs and real estate investors. As business owners, we are faced with tough decisions on a daily basis. These tough decisions can either make us or break us. On the show, you will hear from successful people sharing their stories behind tough decisions that they have had to make along their journey of success. In every episode, you will be able to learn from the thought processes behind the tough decisions that were made. Some of these decisions will have amazing outcomes, and some not so much. So stay tuned for the next daily episode. Do you want to nominate a highly successful entrepreneur or real estate investor to be a guest on this show? Email us at dan@toughdecisions.net. Help us spread the word about the Tough Decisions podcast with your friends, and also take time right now to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, Facebook, or your favorite platform. You've been listening to the Tough Decisions Show.